The Franks, from whom France would get its name, were a Germanic people who had conquered much of Roman-occupied Gaul late in the 5th century CE. After the reign of their great king Clovis, however, their kingdom shrank and fragmented into smaller states that were frequently at war with one another. By the early 800s, the Merovingian royal house that Clovis had established was characterized by figurehead monarchs who would be remembered as the do-nothing kings. The real power in the land resided with the landed and military aristocracy, particularly the mayors of the palace, who were responsible for the administration of the realm. In the 680s, a powerful ruler finally emerged to establish a new Frankish dynasty. This was Pepin of Herstal, who displaced a legitimate hereditary claimant to make himself mayor of the palace of the Frankish splinter kingdom of Austrasia. Beginning in 687, he fought and won a series of battles against other Frankish states to cement his position. Pepin's son Charles went on to fight and rule so forcefully that he was known as Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer. Charles the Hammer managed to reunify the fragmented Frankish kingdom and establish its authority over the Frisians and Saxons. His successor, Pepin, further extended the power and domain of the Franks, at the same time gaining the favor and backing of the Pope in Rome. In 768, Pepin's 26-year-old son, Charles, succeeded his father to the throne. He was enthroned in tandem with his older brother, Charlemagne, but Charlemagne died soon thereafter. A warrior statesman of enormous physical strength and energy, Charles proved to be such an effective leader that the clerics of his court started referring to him in Latin as Carolus Magnus, or Charles the Great. In the French language, he was Charlemagne. Charlemagne's success depended largely upon his remarkable ability to compel loyalty at all levels of French society. He expanded the practice of vassalage begun by his forebears, the mayors of the palace. He exchanged grants of land for loyalty of soldiers and others sworn to serve them. Charlemagne broadened the principle by making personal vassals of all those in high authority, counts, dukes, and church officials, as well as ranking officers, and he encouraged them to follow his example by developing their own network of vassals. As a result, he managed to establish a chain of fealty that reached through every class of society. Later in his life, Charlemagne established his capital at Aachen, a former Roman spa in what would later be Western Germany. But until then, he ruled through a court that traveled with him as he moved throughout his empire. His chief minister, called the Count of the Palace, sifted through matters that came up for royal attention. Those that involved great men or high policy were submitted to the king, while the chief minister adjudicated minor cases himself. Administration of local territory divisions, the comitatus, was usually the responsibility of lesser counts who served at the king's pleasure. In Frankish Gaul, there were about 300 of these small counties. The king commissioned a corps of inspectors to assess the honesty and efficiency of local administrators. The king's own personal magnetism helped gather the notoriously standoffish aristocracy to his government and causes. He was jovial and approachable. When in residence in Aachen, late in his life, he swam every day in the hot springs and would often invite friends and associates, even bodyguards and attendants, to join him. It was not unusual for a visitor to come upon 100 or more men, including Charlemagne himself, frolicking about with great hilarity in the hot waters. Charlemagne imported scholars from England, Ireland, and Italy to his palace to instruct him and his court in astronomy and mathematics, in Greek and Latin. The king encouraged the clergy to become teachers and pressured the church into opening schools in cathedrals, monasteries, and even rural parishes. His palace school at Aachen was the cradle of the Carolingian Renaissance. Calling himself a most devoted son of the church, the king increasingly involved himself in religion. Scarcely any aspect of the spiritual sphere escaped his attention. He headed councils of bishops, was called to rule on ecclesiastical matters, lectured the clergy on how they ought to live, and enjoined his people to pray. He even required that each new pope notify him immediately of his election. Although he demonstrated his genius for the arts of peace, it was Charlemagne's brilliance as a warrior that made all his other achievements possible. Rare was the year in which he did not embark on a campaign. To the southwest, his troops penetrated the Pyrenees and drove the Muslims back to Barcelona and beyond. To the north, they crossed Upper Germany through Friesland to the North Sea and through Saxony to the Baltic. To the east, they took Bavaria and thrust into the central basin of the Danube, where they defeated the Avars. And to the southeast, the Franks intervened in Italy at the request of the Pope when the Lombards assaulted the Papal States. As before, the Franks compelled Pavia to surrender. This time, however, Charlemagne decided to eliminate future problems by annexing the conquered land and, in 774, had himself crowned King of the Lombards. At that point, Charlemagne had established himself as the Colossus of the West. In 781, he began to receive overtures from the empire that still dominated Eastern Europe, Byzantium. They came not from the Eastern Emperor Constantine VI, who was only 11 years of age, but from his widowed mother, Irene, who governed as his regent. A woman of great ambition, Irene proposed to Charlemagne a marriage alliance uniting her son and his daughter, Rotrud, who was then just 6 years old. Such a union, she hoped, might dissuade the Franks from absorbing the remaining Byzantine holdings in southern Italy and Sicily. Charlemagne, for his part, welcomed the opportunity to link his royal house with the empire that still enjoyed enormous prestige. The children were duly betrothed, and Charlemagne's daughter began learning Greek and Byzantine customs, but the arrangement collapsed before any marriage could take place. Charlemagne was not happy when Irene sent an army to invade Benevento, an independent duchy south of Rome. His soldiers helped Benevento's forces defeat the Byzantines. He was further annoyed by Irene's sponsorship of an ecumenical council. The council's decision to rescind the 60-year-old ban on icons, thus removing this divisive issue between Byzantium and Rome, greatly disturbed Charlemagne, who was also annoyed that Irene had not invited him or any of his bishops to this august gathering of the church hierarchy in the first place. Irene had more grandiose plans still. In 797, after falling out with her son, the emperor, she plotted his overthrow, had the young man blinded in order to preclude his return, and then she took the throne in her own name, assuming the full title of emperor rather than empress. In Rome, Pope Leo III viewed the events with a growing sense of concern. Like many others in the West, Leo considered the Byzantine throne vacant because no male occupied it. Leo, moreover, had made some important enemies in Rome and was anxious to ensure the favor and protection of Charlemagne. What better way to do so than to bestow the title of Roman Emperor upon the man who now ruled over much of the West and who served as protector and patrician of the papacy? In 800, during the services on Christmas Day at St. Peter's in Rome, the Pope approached Charlemagne as the king knelt in prayer and placed a magnificent crown upon his head. Then, in a ceremonial chant that was copied from the imperial ritual of the Byzantines, the Roman clergy and congregation shouted their acclamation of Charlemagne. To Charles the Augustus, crowned of God, the great and pacific emperor, life and victory. This was an unequivocal declaration of the final shift of papal loyalty away from Byzantium and to the West. Charlemagne appears not to have taken such a simplistic view of matters. There is some evidence that he was surprised and perhaps put off when the chorus of acclamation was intoned by only the Romans present, not the Franks, who had apparently not been informed of the Pope's plans in advance. In any event, he was to spend most of the remaining years of his life and rule working to secure Byzantine recognition and heal the rift between East and West. It required a great deal of negotiation and some fighting, but eventually, in 811, Charlemagne succeeded in making the Byzantines recognize his imperial title. The Emperor Irene had long since been deposed, and her son Nicephorus had died in battle against the Bulgarians. It was Nicephorus's successor, Michael Rangabe, who ratified the treaty, accepting the idea of two co-equal emperors presiding side by side over the west and east. To the Byzantines, it was an excruciatingly painful moment, for as one of their scribes wrote, "Barbarians and those who have arisen from among foreign peoples were not eligible for the imperial dignity." The Byzantines, however, would go on from this low point in their fortunes to triumphs they could hardly have dreamt of in 800. Charlemagne's heirs, however, would not be so successful in their stewardship of the vast empire he had constructed. While it lasted, it was the largest and most stable political unit to have risen in the West since classical times. But it had been in large measure Charlemagne's personal creation, and his sons and grandsons lacked the great man's vision, supreme statesmanship, military prowess, and vast energy. The empire of Charlemagne was to fall apart within 30 years of his death in 814, as the West entered a period marked by violence and upheaval.